I am new to Detroit. 4.5 years ago, we moved here, and Claire, my wife, said to me about 2 months into our being here, she said, "There is the coolest guy who walks through the campus every day. His name is Richard, and I think he's someone special." And so then we did a little bit of research, and we discovered that he was a Supreme Court judge. And so then the next time I saw Richard walking through the campus, I jumped out, ran out to the walk, and I said, "Judge Bernstein, I want to introduce myself to you." And we had a great conversation, agreed to get together. And then I was asked to speak at a gathering at the Muslim Unity Center. And we were meeting on refugees and how to support refugees. And Richard was the keynote of that meeting, and he was magnificent. And so I thought to myself, this is someone who we should hear speak to us. And so then last year, Richard came and gave a sermon at Evensong that was so important and so powerful, and everybody was transformed by it, that we asked Richard to come back and to preach today at our main service. It's an unusual thing. I'm not sure how many Supreme Court justices have preached at Christ Church Cranbrook on Sunday morning who are Jewish. But what I also am amazed by with Richard in his story is the story of the challenges he's faced, not only with his blindness, but also some amazing challenges that he's faced throughout his the most recent past, where he experienced a devastating injury in New York City while he was walking in Central Park, and has worked hard to recover from that, so much so that last weekend, after he and I were together on that Tuesday, eating at a Lebanese restaurant way into the deep, it was about 11 when we left the restaurant, he went and ran the New York Marathon. So Richard has come back. I wish I had his energy. I am grateful for his spirit, and I am always, I'm always inspired by his love and his commitment and his service and himself. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Judge Bernstein.
Thank you. That's so kind. Good morning, everybody. This is actually the thing that I enjoy the most, is having a more one-on-one, intimate conversation. And I know we're going to go into the main sanctuary shortly, and we can, have the passion, and we can have the joy of kind of coming together in that realm. But what I want to do right now is, the fact that this is such an intimate gathering, I want us to really have a conversation. And I'm going to ask you to think of the most personal questions that you can possibly think of. Because this is a way for us to really learn from each other and have a chance to truly connect. And I have to say, I love Sundays because I always see Sunday as the start of a whole new week. So when you wake up on Sunday morning, however Sunday goes helps to kind of shape the week. And what excites me is having the opportunity to be with you allows for the week to start on such a positive, uplifting note that it creates just a wonderful spirit that I think is going to last throughout the week. So what I'd like to do is really open the floor to you. And I want you to think of the absolute most personal questions you can think of. The more personal you make your question, the more I'm going to enjoy having a chance to answer it. So there's no question that's inappropriate. There's no question that's out of bounds. There's no question that I'm not going to enjoy having a chance to answer. Because again, that's how we grow together. And the only way that we can connect is if we have a chance to really get to know each other. So a few things to kind of throw out there that might kind of get the conversation going is a lot of you are probably kind of curious about, well, what is a blind person's relationship with the Creator? How does somebody who is blind, or who has faced some setback, or who has faced some challenges relate to God? What's the relationship like? How do we get along? How do we kind of develop a connection with each other? You know, is it okay to be angry or frustrated with the Creator? Is it okay to be disappointed, you know, with the Creator? And what is the role of that relationship? And how do you kind of view your legacy and your life and your reason for creation as it pertains to that genuine connectivity with the heavens? The other thing that you might also be curious about before we go upstairs is that you're probably curious about just what are the logistics? How does it work if you're blind? How do you serve as a Supreme Court justice? You know, how do you actually function in that role? How do you go through the cases that you have to go through? How do you review the evidence? How do you appreciate a crime scene? You know, what goes into the job of being a Supreme Court justice if you're not able to see? And then also, I know a lot of times people have a certain curiosity, and I always enjoy talking about this, is what's it like to be athletic if you can't see? So as you heard the pastor say, last Sunday I completed my 22nd marathon in New York City. So how does that work? How do you do 22 marathons if you can't see where you're going? How does that actually work? I also had the opportunity to complete a full Ironman competition. So for those of you who aren't familiar, an Ironman's a 2.4-mile swim followed by a 112-mile bike to be completed by a 26.2-mile run. How does that all work if you're not able to see? So what I want to do is just kind of throw a number of different things kind of on the table and then allow for us to proceed and just really get into a great conversation. So who would like to start with the first question to get our conversation going?
And Brittany
Yes.
has the mic, so she'll bring the mic to you so that we can keep recording and hear.
Cool. And would you like me to repeat
Okay.
the question? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I've got
Oh,
the
actually, I got
mic
the
here.
mic. Okay.
So I'm going to repeat the question I asked you before we
Okay.
started, which was how much light, if any, do you see?
Well, that's a wonderful question. So the way that blind people function, it's not in the sense of visualization. It's the sense of feeling it. It's the sense of experiencing it. It's the sense of appreciating it, but not through vision, but through other realms. And so let me kind of give you an example of that in terms of how it relates. And what I love about speaking at religious institutions is that you can bring everything back to the Creator. So you can bring everything back to a kind of a religious connotation, and that's what I love about it. So it's almost like, I like to give this as an example, which is, you know, so often when we try to understand or appreciate what is the afterworld, you know, what is it that we're going to face when we move on? And what you come to realize when you're blind is that there are certain dimensions that you can't appreciate or understand because you don't have any context. You don't have any perspective. So let me give you an example. If I were to ask you to describe to me what is the color blue, if you've never seen blue, would you be able to do it? And of course the answer is no. If you've never seen blue, you'll never appreciate what blue is. I always use the example of Beethoven, who, as we know, was an incredible composer. But what was the most important thing about Beethoven? He could hear when he was a child. So he knew what music was, and he knew what it sounded like. If he had never heard as a child, he would not be able to appreciate what music was, and he wouldn't be able to compose. So what that means is that when you live in the world without vision, you don't see it or appreciate it the same way that a sighted person ultimately would. So for example, we don't know what people look like. There's just no way. In the movies and things, they'll always say, you know, if you have a blind actor or someone, they'll say, do you want to touch my face? And the idea being that you can touch the woman's face and have an understanding of her beauty. But if you've never seen a human face, even if you're touching the person's face, you still won't be able to appreciate what it physically looks like, because it would require you to have seen at some point or at some time to know what that is. If I were to ask you to describe to me what is a sunset, what is a sunrise, what does the sun look like, what does the sky look like, if you've never seen those things, you'll never be able to appreciate what they are. So in answer to the question, which is a really good question, so often some people who are created live in a completely different world, a totally different world. And when you live in that world, There are some, of course, disadvantages, because everybody would like to know what people look like. Everybody would like to know what a tree looks like or what an animal looks like. I mean, these are things that people would love to be able to appreciate and understand. But when you live in a different world, you come to see it in a completely different context. So when you greet somebody or when you meet somebody, you just simply don't know what they look like. So your appreciation of who they are actually comes off of their energy. You can sense that when you meet another spirit or another being, that there's an energy that exists within them, and you can pick up on that energy. You can sense that energy even before they even speak. So you ultimately wind up living your life in a completely different realm. But what's so interesting for sighted people is that they're never able to really appreciate the unsighted view of the world. Because what people always do is you, as sighted people, will always try to look at the world through vision, right? You're always going to try to use a visual context to describe and understand the world. So whenever you encounter someone who can't see, you try to approach it in a way where you want them to see what you see. But what usually happens is it's just a completely different perspective where you approach the world in a totally different manner, but you appreciate it in a completely different way. Other questions?
Justice Bernstein,
Yes.
could you, I have a sense that you take what some people would call a disability and turn it into a gift. So could you just talk a little bit about some of your work on the international level?
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad that question was asked. So, and we're going to get into that today in the sermon. And this is just my belief. You know, I am not a licensed minister, or I don't have any kind of official credentials. So I'm only going to kind of share with you my personal belief of how I think God creates us kind of for a reason and for a purpose. And this is just kind of what I've always believed. I always believe that we're sent here for a purpose, and that we're sent here for a reason. And that often is the case that we're a part of something that is bigger and grander than just ourselves. The other thing that I also believe from my own life experiences is that life is a very temporary thing. So the idea being that we are sent here on a temporary basis, so that the idea of how we live is that it goes beyond the 100 years that hopefully we get to spend on this planet in the form that we ultimately take. But that rather that, you know, you're here, and if you look at life as a temporary state, so for example, the positions that we hold or the influence that we have, that's a completely temporary perspective. What I believe is that because you're given this, right, because you're given these opportunities, it's my belief that you have to use them to do something transformative. That every single minute or every single moment, you need to use the time that God has given you, the resources that He's given you, the opportunities that He's given you, to have an impact and have an effect on the lives of those who exist around us. And we'll get into this in kind of the more formal remarks, but what I really believe is that we're given our life experiences for a reason. The experiences that we have, and those experiences can be good experiences and they can be bad experiences. But we're given these experiences so that we can use them through the understanding that they create. So often is the case that if you have a certain experience, and let's say it's a tragic experience, or let's say it's a good experience, that ultimately that experience is given to us because we have a certain knowledge that comes from that. And it's not about trying to find joy, and it's not about trying to be happy, and it's not about any of that. It's about having this incredible sense of mission and this incredible sense of purpose and passion. The ancient Greeks used to ask one single question upon a person's death. They would ask, was this an individual who lived their life with passion? And I think what you come to find is that people who go through their life and they face certain hardships or challenges or obstacles, they tend to emerge with this incredible sense of mission. They have this incredible sense of focus, and they live their life with that. And as a result, they tend to kind of appreciate the experiences that they're having. It's funny, I asked my my girlfriend a question, because she is a very joyous spirit. She has a spirit that is filled with happiness. And I asked her, I said, what is it about you? How is it that you find the joy in everything? And she literally, when you see her or you greet her, she just has a genuine effervescent joy that emerges from her spirit. And she said to me that it comes from the idea of gratitude. It's just being grateful for the life and the experiences that you're given. And what happens is that I think, and this is a very simplistic perspective, but I think there are people that fall into two realms. And again, this is a complete oversimplification. You have people that fall into realm A, which are people that have to live their life with some real struggle and adversity, and that's all they know. And then you have a category of people that fall into category B, which are people that, again, this is an oversimplification, but this is a category of people who basically get to live in a more sheltered context. You know, they have a more sheltered approach and appreciation of the world. The reason I'm so intense is because I've been blessed to have the opportunity to fall into both. To live a life where you have to know some struggle, hardship, and adversity, but at the same time, have the resources and the opportunity, because I came from the family I came from, to be able to actually do something about it. The ability to be a part of the process that can create change and make things better. So what Bill asked was about the international work. And I just am very excited about the opportunity that people gave me here in the state of Michigan to serve as a Supreme Court justice. And one of the things that you have to realize is that this was a really extraordinary situation, because I want you to think about something. I want to just take you back to 50 to 60 years ago. It used to be that if you had a child with a severe disability, they used to be sent away. You know, the thought was it's best for severely disabled people to live in institutions, to be isolated, to be segregated, to not be seen or heard from by society in general. That was the kind of prognosis. That was the best thing that you could do for them. And then over time, people with disabilities started to integrate. They started to become a part of the community. They started to have jobs. They started to go to work. They started to go to school. They started becoming a part of the overall neighborhoods and communities that we lived in. And it went from institutionalization to group homes and different things. And a lot of people had a difficult time adjusting to that. In many situations, when you had disabled people moving into neighborhoods, you know, where they would build group homes rather than institutionalization, a lot of those places got firebombed because people were so anxious about the idea of having developmentally disabled people or people with other types of disabilities living kind of in their community that it was met with a tremendous resistance. But over time, people began to connect with it. They felt a peace with it. And then people with disabilities integrated into those communities. And now, when you see disabled people everywhere, you see them at school, you see them at your job, you see them on the bus, you see them at the airport. Now you don't really think anything of it. Now you just think, oh, wow, this is just kind of ordinary. And that's a sign of true progress. When at what time something that was extraordinary becomes ordinary, you realize how far you have come. The reason this election was so significant was because there was a question that had to be posed. And the question was the state of Michigan, and really the nation as a whole, ready to allow for a person with a severe disability to go from being in a position where you live and work amongst people to occupying a seat on the highest court where you actually make decisions that affect the lives of able-bodied people. So the idea was, were people willing to go from the perspective of now allowing a disabled person to serve as an equal to being in a position where the decisions that a disabled person makes are going to affect everybody, their lives, their freedom, their level of equality? And that was the question posed by this election. And the beautiful thing about the result was that the people of the great state of Michigan said, we are definitely ready for a person with a severe disability to occupy this position. Not only are we ready for it, but we embrace it. Because a person with a severe disability has had to face certain struggles, challenges, and hardships that allow for them to understand and appreciate the challenges and difficulties that folks each and every day have to contend with. And that ability to have a connection is what resonated most with people. So what Bill is asking about international is that what was very exciting was that as a judge, what you have to realize is most countries across the world would never allow somebody with a severe disability to occupy this position. It's simply unheard of to even think of this idea. And ultimately, this all starts out of, and I feel bad because I'm going on so long, but this all comes out of a wonderful interaction that I had in New York City. I was in New York, and I was at a wonderful luncheon. And it was a luncheon that was being hosted to honor people that have lost family members to terror in Israel. And this is not a discussion or a commentary on the Middle East. We're not here to discuss Middle East politics in any realm or any manner. It's just to show you how you never know how a single conversation can lead to tremendous change. You never know how a single meeting can literally change the world in the most positive, beautiful way, and how the ripple or butterfly effect truly does take hold and actually is a real thing that does happen. So I was at this lunch, and a wonderful person came over to me. And he would now become probably one of my best friends. I consider him like family. And his name was Shaked. And he said, Richard, I have been watching you at this lunch, and I'm a pilot in the Israeli Air Force. And he said to me, he said, you know, I would love to work with you on something. I believe that through military service, we can have better integration. And as you all know, in Israel, when you enter the Israeli military, if you're a man, you spend 3 years from 18 on. If you're a woman, you spend 2 years. So service is compulsory. But what would happen is that people with disabilities that wanted to serve would be immediately discharged. They would be sent home and said, thank you for your service, but because of your disability, we don't have a place for you. And my friend Shaked said, would you be willing to work with me to help change the system, to allow for anyone who wants to serve to have the chance to serve, to be a part of something bigger than themselves? Would you be willing to work with me to do this? He said, but here's the thing. Because of my role as a pilot, I can never have my face shown, and no one can ever really know who I am. But they can know who you are. And I would like to work behind the scenes within the military, but have you be the front person on it. He said, are you willing to do that? And I said, I would love and be honored to work with you on that. And so it's interesting, the difference between Israelis and Americans. Americans, you say, oh, that sounds like a great idea. I would love it. You think you're never going to hear from that person ever again. You know, it's a great idea, totally on board, totally call me, totally into it. And it never happens. You never see them again, and that's it. And so I get a call like 2 weeks later. And he says, OK, we're all set. You're going to be the first blind person to do a half Ironman in a lot. He says, I've worked it out through Special Forces. I've worked it out through the IDF. We're going to go there together. It's going to be a major event in Israel. We're going to do it with Special Forces. We're going to do it with the Air Force. And we're going to show the capabilities of people with disabilities to show what can be done if given that opportunity. So I had to fly to Israel. We did it. And then we went over to the Kiryat, which is their Pentagon. And the generals told us, we love this initiative. This is a fantastic initiative. It's going to bring people together. It's going to get people excited. But here's the deal. We can pass down an order, but you have to go to each base and get each commander to buy into this initiative. And we did that. We would go to all the bases across the country. We would run marathons. We would do triathlons. We would sit with all the reporters. We would talk to everybody. And we got people excited. And then what would happen was they found that those bases that participated in our program had the highest level of morale within the entire IDF system, and they had the highest efficiency within the IDF system. So more and more bases started to participate. And the program became so successful that the Knesset actually then went and passed Israel's version of their Disabilities Act that created opportunities for disabled people all across the country. That was so successful that Israeli companies then started hiring people with disabilities and started doing active recruitment of special needs populations. That became so successful that Israeli government agencies mandated a 3% hiring of all people with disabilities. That became so successful that the Knesset started appointing Israel's first disabled judges. They appointed a judge who is a wheelchair user to be the chief judge of Jerusalem, and then they went on to appoint a blind judge to serve in that capacity as well. That became so successful that Israel asked if I'd be willing to address the United Nations to showcase what can be done if people have a certain energy or excitement or a vitality to do something. So they said, we have good news and bad news for you. You're going to be, in the United Nations, you have to be invited by a country to represent them. You can't just speak at the UN. You have to be invited by a nation to be a guest speaker. So I was Israel's guest, and they said, we have good news and bad news. You're going to be addressing over 150 countries at the United Nations. The bad news is it's going to be in Vienna, and you have to go in February. So I flew to Vienna in February to address, literally, I think there was 100, I think it might have been 125. I think it was 125 nations, 15 different languages. And there's some funny things that came out of it, which was I learned that I'm apparently, like, now in doing this kind of work, I realize that we need special levels of translation because I'm a very fast, high energy, impassioned talker and very, I talk a lot, so it requires, they said that you have to require 2 translators, not just 1, because of the fact that it's very taxing on the translators. But what was funny is that you never know where a conversation's going to lead. Because after presenting to the United Nations about what we were able to do in Israel, within the military, within society, within passing legislation, within the judiciary, Austria actually changed its rules and regulations. It used to be illegal to be a judge in Austria. Not just difficult, there were actual laws that would prohibit somebody from serving in this capacity. And the president of Austria and the parliament after this event, because the UN event garnered so much attention and it captured so many headlines that a number of the Austrian Profil, which is kind of their New York Times magazine, did a huge publication on this. And what happened is that triggered an entire discussion within Austria about the role of special needs populations, that Austria changed its laws. Not just to allow for people who are blind to serve as judges, but it loosened its restrictions and opened up career opportunities and advancement for special needs populations all across the country. We then had to fly to Spain. The United Nations held an event in Spain because what Spain saw in Austria was then duplicated because in Spain, you had issues where if you had a disability, this was kind of remarkable, you weren't permitted to vote. And in fact, the Spanish courts had held that people with disabilities didn't have an understanding or appreciation of the core values or the core definitions of democracy. And as a result, because they didn't understand what democracy was, they weren't permitted to vote. So we changed that, though. And you have to do it in a very positive way. You can't be combative. You can't be disappointed. You can't be frustrated. You have to do it in a positive way. So we went. We had a major UN conference in Spain, generated tremendous coverage and interest. And you know what happened? They changed it. They realized that this was something they could do. They realized that they hadn't seen this in a way that they should see it. And without being combative or without being difficult or without having to shame people, they realized the possibilities of what could be done, and they changed it overwhelmingly. We had to fly to Australia because in Australia, it was actually illegal if you were blind to fly without a caregiver. You had to have a caregiver on the plane with you, the idea being that you couldn't travel for yourself. They changed that. They realized that, we went to Australia. We did all the morning shows. We did all the TV programs. We spoke to all the major newspapers. And guess what? They said, we will totally change this. Parliament changed it immediately. In Australia, they also had certain rules that said you couldn't be on a jury, and you also couldn't be a judge in Australia if you had a severe disability. They changed it. We didn't have to argue or fight. You just got them excited about it, and they made those changes. Ecuador actually put into its constitution all new rights and responsibilities for special needs populations, and the Italian government, the Italian judicial system, and heading to Rome actually next week, is going to be making some major changes as well to create a more inclusive ideology. I want to share this with you for this specific purpose or for this specific reason. This is an amazing church. This church has a wonderful history, and you're all people who have dedicated yourself to making life better for those who exist around you. There is one core principle that comes out of all of this that I believe so fervently in, and that is this. When you want to make change, you don't have to worry about logistics. You don't have to worry about specificity in terms of how you're going to do it. If you're able to get people excited, if you're able to get people enthused, everything else falls into place after that. You don't have to worry about how are we going to do this? How are we going to create this? How are we going to do this specifically? If you're able to get people excited, if you can get a country excited, Australia got excited. If you go on the morning shows and you're all worked up and you're all enthused, guess what? I would walk around Sydney and people walk over, oh, you're the blind justice, I'm all excited. And they'd be like, I talked to my person in Parliament and said that we need to make these changes. And once people got excited, there was no stopping it. Because I got a call, just to give you one quick example, I got a call from Korea. The Korean government called me. And they said, Justice Bernstein, we're reaching out to you because, there's this whole movement and the UN is all excited. Because what happens is once a movement starts, and a movement can be for good or it can be for bad. But let's just focus on the positive. If you can start a positive movement, right, it's infectious. If people get excited or enthused and really want to, and people's inner spirit is a good spirit. People have genuine goodness that exists within them. And once that goodness exists, and people can tap into that positivity that exists within us all, there's no stopping that excitement or that enthusiasm. And to give you an example of this, I get a call from the Korean government. And they said, Justice Bernstein, we are really excited. We heard about what was going on in Australia. We heard about Austria. We heard about what happened in Spain. We heard about all these things in Israel. And they said, we have decided here in Korea that we are going to name our first blind judge. That we want judges to be disabled, and that we are going to make this a major priority of the South Korean government, is to make the judiciary more inclusive and more open to those who want to serve. And I said, well, that's wonderful. And they said, but we're calling you because we have one question. And I said, what's the question? I said, this is great, congratulations. I said, tell me your question. They said, how do we do it? And so, but the thing is, and so of course we're going to work together because people don't know how to do it. And this is a new concept. It's something that they hadn't explored or haven't uncovered or haven't even thought about. It's a brand new idea. But the thing is that once the Korean government has decided that this is what they're going to do, it's going to be done. The rest of the things that you have to do are easy. It's just logistics. It's just figuring out how many clerks the person needs, how do we make adjustments, how do we do these kinds of things. All of that is easy. The most important thing that we can do if you want to make a change for whatever that is, for whatever you believe in, for whatever you think is a just and noble cause, for whatever you have passion about, the most important thing is garnering excitement, enthusiasm, and passion. Because once you do that, everything else flows from it. The only downside for me is I don't like traveling, and you have to actually go to these places. They won't let you phone it in. You have to physically go there to do it, because if you try to phone it in, they're going to say, no one's going to get excited unless you actually have to physically be here. Other questions?
And just to give you, we've got 12 more minutes.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Yeah, but it was great.
Oh, thanks. Okay, who's got our...
Right. Thank you very much for sharing with us your enthusiasm for blind judges. Right. Last night I got a question from my grandson. He happens to be 8.
Okay.
He lives in Canada, and he had to give a talk to his school about Armistice Day and the war and all that stuff. And he said, what did your father and your wife's father do during the war? Now, it so happens that my father fought on, quote, the right side, and my wife's father was on the other side. So how can we say both of these people are enthusiastic about what they thought were right, but how do you reconcile the fact that different people have different ideas as to what is right?
It's a great question. I would answer that question by saying, if we're looking back to kind of, wars, especially the great wars and the big wars, I understand that I don't want to bring like politics into it, but I think overall, I think if you were to look at World War II, I think it's pretty clear that it was an absolute battle between good versus evil. I don't think there's any question that that was just, for all intents and purposes, you know, a battle to save the world, to save our way of life. I mean, it was a battle for basic humanity. I think it's one of those situations where the greatest generation preserved our ability to live in freedom, and they preserved justice, and they preserved goodness, and they preserved the planet Earth so to be inhabited by people of goodness. I think what will tend to happen in certain situations, you know, per your question is that, you know, evil will always give rise. There will always be evil. Evil will always exist. But what I believe, and I think this kind of comes down to just seeing it from an optimistic perspective, is that evil will always do harm. And evil will always create destruction. And evil will always create death. And evil will always do these things that evil just naturally does. But I do believe, overall, what usually does happen is that good will usually prevail. That goodness and kindness will usually overcome. I mean, no one could basically go back, and if you're looking at, you know, World War II, I think that really was a defeat of just all-out evil. And ultimately, the damage that was done is an incalculable amount of damage that will have changed the trajectory of our way of life forever. But if you look at kind of the fact that overall, good did prevail and good did survive. So I think, though, taking it out of the war context, your question, which I think is, you know, a very intensive question, and taking it out of like the Great War question, I think looking at it from the way you could go back to like talking to an 8-year-old is saying, for the most part, the general issues that we contend with each and every day kind of here in our country, you know, the key is that I've always said and I've always believed that, again, it goes back to our life experiences. And our life experiences allow for us to understand and appreciate the world that we live in. We're all shaped by the experiences that God chooses for us. He chooses the experiences that we're given. And I think often is the case when you look at people in terms of what their beliefs are, when you look at what they're fighting for, when you look at what they feel is just and right, that's going to be shaped by their experiences, by the life that they have lived, by the experiences that they know, by the story that they tell. So I think telling your 8-year-old, let's take it out of the war context, and let's take it out of the political context, and let's take it out of the general conceptual notion of right versus wrong, and let's just take it to our everyday kind of ordinary relationships with others. I think what's always important, and I think what judges do, is you always have to see it from the other person's perspective. You always have to see it from the other person's side. You always have to respect another person's opinion or another person's viewpoint, because that is a viewpoint, or that is an ideology that is well-founded. That's a viewpoint and that's an ideology that comes from an experience, that comes from the life that they live, that comes from the way that they were created. And I think the key essence of it, especially as a judge, is always trying to weigh both sides, always trying to hear what everybody is saying, always making sure that people have the opportunity to put forth their argument, always making sure that someone walks out of your courtroom, they might not agree with the decision that you made. They might not agree with the decision that you rendered, but they have to believe that it was done fairly. They have to believe that they were heard and that they were respected. And I think really at the end of the day, what it comes down to in terms of kind of our own discourse, and again, taking this out of the context of World War II and World War I and just kind of putting it into kind of how we relate to each other and how we interact kind of as communities and as people, what it really comes down to, this is just what I believe, and take it for what it's worth, it comes down to the idea that people need to be respected. That's what it comes down to. People need to feel and need to know that they are respected, that they are heard, that they are understood, that they are appreciated and they are valued. That's really what it comes down to. Anger, frustration, sadness, those types of emotions, those types of feelings come out of a situation where somebody doesn't feel that they were listened to, that they were respected. They feel belittled. They feel patronized. If people feel respected, if they feel that you connect, if they feel that you understand, if they feel that you relate, you might not agree. You might totally disagree with their viewpoint. But I think people's general spirit bends towards compassion, kindness, and warmth. When people meet each other, the first initial human reaction is to like the person. That's the initial reaction. When you first meet somebody, what is your first initial reaction? Your first initial inherent instinctive reaction is to enjoy meeting that person, is to look forward to talking to them. Your initial reaction when you first come upon a person you don't know is you like them. That's just your initial reaction. And that's who we are as people, and that's the way that we're created. Other questions?
Yeah, I think that even though we have a bit, I think we're gonna pause at this point, and the reason is we want to make sure that we get you all oriented and everything is upstairs and ready to go. Feel free. I know that some of you came to the 8 o'clock service. Feel free to double up on church today. I guarantee you, it will be wonderful. It will be an amazing experience. You will be enriched by this, and I think you'll be inspired. And please join me. That was such a wonderful, incredible presentation of so many things, of your itinerary, of all the ways that you've experienced your life changing, the way that you've helped so many people in terms of inclusion and in terms of equity and in terms of participation. We're in awe of you, Richard, and I'm so grateful to call you my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you.